It started as a mission of hope, a journey that seemed destined to mend not just fractured land, but fractured hearts. Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, touched down in Angola with a confident smile, greeted by photographers and aides who knew all too well the importance of this moment. He wasn't just there to walk through minefields or encourage donations for demoning operations. He was there to rewrite the narrative about himself, a narrative that had spun out of control since stepping back from his royal duties. But the air was heavy even before his first handshake. Behind the scenes, whispers swirled about his insistence on protocol. Those close to the matter hinted that Harry, still aching from being stripped of his royal titles, had one non-negotiable request, that he be addressed as His Highness during his engagements. It was, to him, not just a title but a tether to the man he used to be, the soldier prince, the son of Diana, the man who once commanded global respect. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. As Harry made his way through the Angolan capital, the streets lined with curious onlookers and tight-lipped security, he carried himself like a man trying to project calm and purpose. But those who knew him best could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands flexed as though clenching an invisible sword. This was not just another philanthropic tour. This was his attempt to prove to his father, and perhaps to himself, that he still mattered on the world stage. The anticipation built as he arrived for the private meeting with Angola's President João Lourenço. The room was stately but understated, lined with dark wood paneling and the hum of an air conditioner cutting through the stifling African heat. Harry's aides hovered nearby, exchanging polite smiles with Angolan officials. And then it happened, the first sign that this meeting was about to veer off course. When the president welcomed Harry, he used the words, "Mr. Harry," instead of the expected "Your Highness." It was a small thing. To most, perhaps insignificant. But to Harry, it was like a slap across the face. Witnesses later described how the room seemed to freeze in that instant. Harry's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, lips tightening, eyes narrowing, a flicker of disbelief dancing across his features. He glanced briefly at his aides as though to confirm he hadn't misheard. But the president continued, his tone measured and diplomatic, with no hint of recognition that he had crossed an invisible line. Those seated nearby later said Harry tried to recover his composure, nodding stiffly as the conversation moved forward. But the mood had soured. What was meant to be a warm dialogue about humanitarian aid became tense, punctuated by Harry's clipped responses and the careful maneuvering of his aides. And then, as if the fragile dam inside him burst, Harry rose abruptly from his chair. Reports differ on what exactly he said, but according to one source, his voice was sharp, brimming with restrained fury. "I came here in good faith, to continue my mother's work. The least I expect is basic respect." The president's response was calm, almost chilling in its firmness. "Respect is mutual, Mr. Harry. Titles are earned, not imposed." The silence that followed was deafening. Without another word, Harry turned and strode out of the room, his aides scrambling behind him. Doors closed, cameras clicked, and within hours the story was everywhere, from London tabloids to international news outlets. What had begun as a noble endeavor was now framed as a royal tantrum. But was it really that simple? To understand why Prince Harry reacted the way he did, one must peel back the layers of pain and pride that have defined his journey since leaving the royal fold. This was not just about a title. It was about identity, belonging, and the constant tug-of-war between the man he wants to be and the prince the world still sees, or refuses to see. As the dust settled over Angola, the questions began to swirl. Was Harry justified in expecting deference? Or was this another misstep in a series of PR disasters that have plagued his post-royal life? Did this moment reveal a man fighting for respect, or a man consumed by ego? Whatever the truth, one thing was clear. The boy who once walked behind his mother's coffin, stoic and heartbroken, was now a man wrestling with the heavy crown of legacy and the even heavier weight of losing it. And as the world watched, it became obvious that this was more than a diplomatic spat. It was a window into Harry's ongoing battle with the only war he is yet to win, the war within himself. The weight of a royal title is something few people in the world will ever understand. To most, it's just words. an elegant string of syllables uttered before a name, a formality steeped in centuries of tradition. But for Prince Harry, it had become something far more complex. It was both a shield and a prison, a mark of honor and a reminder of everything he had left behind. As a young boy, Harry grew up hearing, "Your Royal Highness," whispered reverently in the corridors of palaces and shouted excitedly by crowds that gathered wherever his family went. To him, the title wasn't just protocol, it was a part of his identity. It was the way the world acknowledged his place in the story of a monarchy that stretched back over 1,000 years. Yet, as he sat staring out the window of his private jet on the flight to Angola, Harry couldn't help but feel the sting of irony. The man they now called Mr. Harry had once been second in line to the throne. He had been a soldier, a prince, a son of Diana. Now, stripped of his royal responsibilities and titles, he felt adrift. The transition from His Royal Highness to simply Harry had been as jarring as stepping out of a suit of armor and into civilian clothes in the middle of a battlefield. Those close to him said that even in private moments, Harry struggled to reconcile the life he once had with the one he had chosen. He would often speak of the comfort he felt when addressed as Your Highness by those who still clung to old habits. It wasn't vanity, he insisted. It was a tether to a world he never thought he'd leave. And yet, the world had moved on faster than he imagined. The decision to leave his royal role had not been taken lightly. When he and Meghan announced their step back in 2020, they spoke of a desire for independence, for a chance to live beyond the rigid structures of Buckingham Palace. But independence came at a cost. Titles, security, military honors, all stripped away as part of the deal. To the Queen and senior royals, it was the natural consequence of stepping outside the firm. To Harry, it felt like punishment. In private, he was said to have wrestled with an internal contradiction. He had left to escape the suffocating weight of his royal identity, but now he felt lost without it. When he walked into rooms and people failed to rise, failed to offer the deference he had grown accustomed to, it was like a sharp pinch reminding him of how much had changed. The media had not been kind in their portrayal of this struggle. Headlines called him the ex-prince and accused him of clinging to past glory. Satirical cartoons depicted him walking around Los Angeles with a crown-shaped void over his head. Even those sympathetic to his plight wondered if Harry was truly prepared for a life without the privileges that came with his former position. This was the context Harry carried with him as he boarded that plane to Angola. The trip had been meticulously planned, walking through minefields, meeting local leaders, and promoting humanitarian efforts. These were all part of a carefully orchestrated effort to remind the world, and perhaps his family, of his worth. But beneath the noble intentions lay a fragile ego desperately seeking validation. Harry's aides were well aware of the stakes. Before every engagement, they rehearsed introductions with local officials, gently nudging them toward using the honorifics Harry preferred. It wasn't mandatory, of course. Harry no longer had an official claim to His Highness, but his team argued that as a courtesy to his past status and in recognition of his humanitarian work, it was appropriate. In the days leading up to the meeting with Angola's president, whispers of unease circulated among Harry's staff. Some Angolan officials had resisted the idea of addressing Harry as His Highness, citing protocol and the fact that he was no longer an active member of the royal family. To them, he was a philanthropist and a public figure, not a visiting prince. Harry's aides tried to downplay the issue, hoping it wouldn't escalate. But Harry himself was less forgiving. Sources later revealed that he saw the matter as symbolic, a litmus test for how the world perceived him. Was he still a prince in the eyes of others, or merely another celebrity using his fame for influence? These questions haunted him as the plane descended into Luanda, the Angolan capital. From his seat, he watched the landscape unfold below: red earth, scattered settlements, and, beyond them, the scars left by decades of civil war. This was the land his mother had walked decades earlier, famously photographed in protective gear as she navigated active minefields. That image of Diana had become one of her most enduring legacies, a reminder of her compassion and courage. Harry had come to Angola in part to honor that legacy. But in truth, he also came to remind the world that he, too, carried her fire. He wanted to show that even without a palace behind him, he could still wield influence for good. Yet deep down, there was a nagging insecurity. Would people see him as Diana's son, the prince continuing her work, or as a man clinging to a title no longer his to claim? As he stepped off the plane and into the African sun, Harry tried to push these thoughts aside. Cameras clicked, journalists shouted questions, and aides scrambled to keep pace. But the question lingered in his mind like an itch he couldn't scratch. If they don't call me His Highness, what am I? And that question, more than any protocol or diplomatic slight, was the seed of the storm that was about to erupt. The air was thick with heat and anticipation as the engines of Harry's jet wound down on the tarmac of Luanda International Airport. The rhythmic thrum of the propellers faded, replaced by the murmur of voices outside and the faint clicking of cameras being prepared for the perfect shot. For Harry, this moment was more than just another arrival in a foreign country. It was a test, a chance to demonstrate that, even without the trappings of royalty, he could command respect, influence policy, and honor the memory of his mother in a way no one else could. The plane door opened, releasing a burst of cool, recycled air into the sweltering African sun. Harry appeared in the doorway, dressed in khaki trousers and a crisp white shirt rolled to his elbows. A pair of sunglasses shielded his eyes, but his jaw was set in a way that betrayed the tension beneath his calm exterior. Cameras clicked furiously as photographers fought for the best angle. Below, a delegation of Angolan officials waited with carefully practiced smiles. Among them were aides from the president's office, humanitarian workers, and a small security contingent. The greeting party was polite but understated. No grand fanfare, no royal trumpets, no crimson carpet unfurling in his path. It wasn't an intentional slight, but the absence of ceremony was noticeable. Harry descended the steps slowly, trying to project warmth and confidence. He extended his hand to the Angolan Minister of Foreign Affairs, who introduced himself with a broad grin. The minister's greeting was warm and effusive, but when he addressed Harry, he used the words, "Welcome to Angola, Mr. Harry." For a brief second, Harry's smile faltered. It was subtle, so subtle that most onlookers wouldn't have noticed. But those closest to him knew that behind the smile was a man trying to keep his emotions in check. Harry nodded, shaking the minister's hand firmly. "Thank you," he replied evenly, his voice betraying no hint of irritation. Yet in his mind, the words echoed, "Mr. Harry. Not Your Highness. Not even Prince Harry." The aides trailing him exchanged nervous glances. They had anticipated this moment. In the days leading up to the trip, there had been intense discussions behind closed doors about how Harry would be introduced during official engagements. His team had requested, politely but firmly, that Angolan officials refer to him as His Highness, as a gesture of respect for his past position and his continuing humanitarian work. The Angolans, however, had pushed back. To them, protocol was clear. Harry was no longer an active royal. While they acknowledged his noble lineage and appreciated his advocacy for demoning efforts, they considered him a private citizen on a philanthropic mission. Titles, they argued, were reserved for heads of state and official representatives of sovereign nations. Harry's team had hoped for a quiet compromise. Perhaps the officials would bend protocol slightly, even as a courtesy. But as Harry moved down the receiving line and each person greeted him as Mr. Harry, it became clear that no such concession had been made. As the convoy of black SUVs pulled away from the airport, Harry stared out the window, his reflection flickering in the tinted glass. The streets of Luanda buzzed with life. Vendors hawking fruit and bottled water, children weaving between cars, and clusters of men gathered in the shade of crumbling buildings to escape the relentless sun. This was a country still healing from the scars of a brutal civil war. Landmines, hidden remnants of decades-old conflict, still dotted rural areas, posing a constant threat to villagers and children playing in fields. It was the same issue that had brought Diana here years ago. Her visit to Angola in 1997 had drawn international attention to the crisis, leading to a surge in global funding for demoning operations. Harry had come to continue that work, to shine a light on a humanitarian crisis that was too often forgotten. But now, sitting in the air-conditioned silence of the SUV, he couldn't help but feel a nagging sense of unease. Was the refusal to use his title merely a matter of protocol? Or was it a subtle signal that the world no longer saw him as the prince he once was? As the convoy turned a corner, Harry caught sight of a massive billboard depicting his mother in her iconic protective gear, walking cautiously through a minefield. The image stirred something deep within him, a mixture of pride and longing. Diana had never needed a title to command respect. Her compassion and courage had transcended royal formality. Harry's thoughts were interrupted by his aide seated across from him. "Sir," she began, then hesitated, correcting herself. "Harry, we've confirmed the schedule with the president's office. The meeting will take place in his private chambers this afternoon." Harry nodded distractedly. "Did they respond to our request regarding the honorifics?" The aide glanced down at her notes, then looked back up, her expression tight. "They're standing by their protocol. They'll be addressing you as Mr. Harry." A heavy silence settled over the car. Harry turned his gaze back to the window. His fingers drummed absently on his knee as he watched the cityscape give way to stretches of open land. "It's not about ego," he muttered after a long pause. "It's about respect, about what this work represents." The aide didn't respond. She had heard these words before, spoken in different tones, in different places. She knew Harry's struggle wasn't just with the world, but with himself. The convoy arrived at a modest compound on the outskirts of the city where Harry was scheduled to meet mine-clearing teams. As he stepped out of the SUV, local children gathered nearby, waving small Angolan flags. Harry's face softened as he crouched to greet them, offering warm smiles and kind words. Cameras captured the moment, and for a few precious minutes, the tension seemed to lift. But beneath the surface, the unease remained. The meeting with President Lorenzo loomed large in Harry's mind. He had rehearsed his talking points, demoning strategies, funding appeals, the symbolic importance of this visit. Yet one thought kept intruding, stubborn and unrelenting. If they refuse to call me His Highness, how can I expect them to take me seriously at all? As the sun climbed higher in the Angolan sky, Harry straightened his shoulders and prepared himself for the meeting that would define the trip. Little did he know, it would also become the spark for a scandal that would ripple far beyond Angola's borders. The sun hung high over Luanda as the heat pressed down on the city like an invisible weight. Inside the presidential compound, the air conditioning hummed quietly, offering a stark contrast to the blistering air outside. The polished wooden doors leading to President Lorenzo's private meeting chamber were shut, guarded by two stoic soldiers in crisp uniforms. Prince Harry stood in the adjacent hallway, adjusting his cuff as though preparing for battle. His aides whispered last-minute reminders, their voices low but hurried. The atmosphere was tense, charged with a sense of importance and fragility. This wasn't just any meeting. It was the pinnacle of Harry's visit to Angola, a chance to secure the government's support for demoning projects, and, perhaps more importantly for him, an opportunity to reassert his stature on the world stage. But beneath the surface, Harry's thoughts churned with unease. The earlier introductions at the airport still gnawed at him. Each time an Angolan official had greeted him with Mr. Harry, it felt like a tiny cut to his pride. He had managed to keep his composure then, but this meeting was different. Here, in this room, with cameras excluded and aides kept to a minimum, there would be no distractions, no buffers. "Are we clear on the seating arrangements?" Harry asked, his voice tight. "Yes," replied one of his senior aides, a man in his 40s with a clipped British accent. "You'll be seated to the president's right. We've ensured your talking points are at hand, and we'll step in to support where needed." "And the form of address?" Harry pressed, his gaze sharp. The aide hesitated. "We've done what we can. The president's team has been firm. They will address you as Mr. Harry." Harry's jaw clenched. "Not even Prince Harry. They said they'll refer to you as a distinguished guest and humanitarian. But no royal titles." For a long moment, Harry said nothing. His fingers tapped against his thigh, a silent rhythm of frustration. To him, this wasn't about vanity or clinging to a bygone era. It was about respect. About how his mother's legacy deserved to be carried forward with the dignity of a prince's name. "Fine," he said at last, though his tone carried no trace of acceptance. "Let's get on with it." The double doors opened silently, and Harry stepped inside. The room was stately but unpretentious. A long mahogany table stretched across the space, flanked by leather chairs. Tall windows allowed shafts of sunlight to cut through the air, dancing across the glossy surface. At the head of the table sat President João Lourenço, a seasoned leader with calm eyes that betrayed neither warmth nor hostility. "Welcome to Angola," the president said, rising to shake Harry's hand. "It is an honor to host you here, Mr. Harry." There it was again. Harry's handshake was firm, but his eyes flickered ever so slightly. "Thank you for having me," he replied, his voice even but laced with restraint. The two men took their seats as aides filed in and positioned themselves discreetly along the walls. Water glasses clinked softly as they were placed on coasters. The faint scent of polished wood and citrus lingered in the air. Harry began with carefully rehearsed words. He spoke of Angola's progress in clearing landmines, of the lives saved and communities restored. He invoked the memory of his mother's visit to the very same minefields decades earlier. Princess Diana believed in the power of collaboration, Harry said, his voice steady. She knew that only through unity and shared vision could we rid the world of these deadly remnants of war. It is in that spirit that I come to you today, to ask Angola to continue its vital support for demoning efforts. The president listened intently, his hands folded neatly on the table. When Harry finished, Lorenzo nodded. "We are deeply grateful for your mother's legacy, Mr. Harry," he said. "Angola owes much to her advocacy, and we are committed to seeing this work through." Harry's aide shifted slightly in the corner of the room, sensing the tension in her principal's shoulders. "Thank you, Mr. President," Harry replied. "And if I may, while I no longer serve in an official royal capacity, I carry with me the same sense of duty and responsibility to this cause. I hope that in the spirit of respect and continuity, I might be addressed as His Highness during these proceedings." The words hung in the air like a fragile glass ornament. President Lorenzo's expression remained unchanged. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy and unyielding. Then the president spoke. "With all respect, Mr. Harry," he said evenly, "titles are a matter of protocol. You are here as a humanitarian, not as a representative of the British Crown. That is how we recognize you." Harry's face tightened. He inhaled sharply, his fingers curling slightly on the table. "I understand protocol, Mr. President," he said, his voice edged with steel. "But this is about more than protocol. This is about acknowledging a legacy that transcends bureaucracy." The president's gaze held steady. "And yet, respect is mutual. It does not require titles." The words stung more than Harry cared to admit. For a split second, the mask of diplomacy slipped, and his frustration flickered across his face. Witnesses later described the next moments as charged, almost electric. Harry leaned back slightly in his chair, his lips pressed into a thin line. He glanced toward his aides, as if weighing whether to continue or concede. Then, in one swift motion, he pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. "If my presence here is not enough to warrant basic courtesy," he said, his voice low but firm, "then perhaps this meeting is over." The room froze. Aides exchanged alarmed looks, but dared not speak. "Harry," one of his team began, but he raised a hand to silence her. Without another word, Harry turned and strode toward the door. The quiet shuffle of his footsteps on the polished floor seemed louder than any outburst could have been. His aides scrambled to gather papers and follow, their faces pale with shock. President Lorenzo remained seated, his expression unreadable. Only when the doors closed behind the departing prince did he murmur something to his chief of staff in Portuguese. The silence in that room would echo long after Harry's departure. Outside, as Harry descended the steps and into the waiting SUV, photographers who had been kept at bay for privacy now caught a glimpse of his stormy expression. Within hours, the story would break across continents. Prince Harry storms out of meeting after title snub. And so began the unraveling of what was meant to be a triumphant visit. The car doors slammed shut, muffling the sounds of the world outside as Harry sank into the leather seat of the SUV. The hum of the air conditioner felt loud in the silence, but it did little to cool the heat rising from within him. His knuckles were white where his fists clenched on his lap, and his jaw was set so tightly it looked as though it might crack. The aide sitting across from him hesitated, her lips parted as if to speak, but then thought better of it. Harry didn't want words. Not now. Not when his mind replayed the scene over and over like a broken reel. The steady voice of President Lorenzo refusing to use his title, the calm assertion that respect was mutual, and finally, the cold silence that had filled the room as he made his abrupt exit. To Harry, the refusal felt like more than a slight. It felt like an erasure, a dismissal of not only who he had been, but also the work he was trying to do. He had come to Angola to honor his mother's memory, to champion a cause he believed in deeply. But all of it now felt overshadowed by what he perceived as a personal humiliation. The convoy began its slow crawl back toward the city center, weaving through streets crowded with vendors and pedestrians. From the shaded alleys and market stalls, curious eyes followed the line of black vehicles. Some recognized the British prince in the back seat. Others had only a vague sense of the man who was visiting their country to talk about landmines. Harry stared out the window, but the vibrant colors of Luanda's streets barely registered in his mind. Instead, he was consumed by an internal dialogue, one part anger, one part self-doubt. Why had they refused? Was it simply about protocol, or was there something more, some deeper judgment about him? Was this how the world saw him now, as a man without rank, a prince in name only? These questions festered, feeding a growing resentment that threatened to overwhelm his normally composed exterior. Meanwhile, inside the presidential compound, President Lourenço sat quietly with his advisors. The Angolan leader had been unmoved by Harry's abrupt departure. Titles do not clear minds, he reportedly told his chief of staff. Work does. For him, the issue had been clear-cut. Harry was no longer an official representative of the British crown. To address him as His Highness would have been a breach of Angola's diplomatic protocols, and Lourenço was not a man accustomed to bending rules for symbolic gestures. Yet among Harry's aides, the reaction was far less measured. In hushed voices, they debated how to manage the fallout from what had just occurred. "We can't let this become a media circus," one of them whispered urgently. This trip was supposed to be about the landmines, not this. But it was already too late. Word of Harry's walkout had leaked within an hour. An Angolan journalist who had been waiting outside the compound caught sight of the prince leaving in a huff, his face a storm of restrained fury. By the time Harry's convoy reached his hotel, the story was spreading across social media like wildfire. Prince Harry storms out of presidential meeting after refusing to be called Mr. Harry. Angola snubs Harry's royal title. Prince walks out. Is Harry obsessed with titles? New diplomatic row raises questions. The headlines varied in tone, some sympathetic, others mocking. But all shared the same core narrative. A former prince demanding deference and storming off when he didn't get it. Inside his hotel suite, Harry paced the floor while aides scrambled to draft a statement. "Sir, we need to respond before this spins out of control," one of them said carefully. Harry stopped mid-step and turned sharply. "Do not call me sir. Not now." The aide flinched but nodded. Harry raked a hand through his hair, his mind whirring. He had come here to focus attention on a humanitarian crisis, to inspire action and generosity. Instead, he had become the story, the wrong story. His thoughts turned to Meghan. She wasn't with him on this trip. They had agreed it was better for him to handle this engagement alone. But what would she say when she heard about this? Would she tell him he had done the right thing by standing up for himself? Or would she urge him to let go of the formalities, to focus on the bigger picture? And then there was his father. Harry's relationship with King Charles had been strained ever since his departure from royal life. This trip was meant to be a step toward reconciliation, a demonstration that Harry could still act with the dignity and sense of duty his family valued, even outside the royal fold. But how would Charles view this incident? As a son defending his dignity, or as yet another embarrassment to the crown? For Harry, these questions were more than political. They were deeply personal, rooted in the insecurities and wounds he carried from years of public scrutiny and private pain. Meanwhile, on the streets of London, the British press was having a field day. Pundits debated the incident on television panels, some defending Harry's desire for respect, others ridiculing him as a man clinging to the trappings of a life he had willingly abandoned. A commentator on one program sneered, "You can't have it both ways." He walked away from his royal duties, from the privileges and the responsibilities. And yet he wants to be treated like a prince? That's not how the world works. But another guest countered, "It's not about privilege. It's about his identity. Imagine having the only life you've ever known stripped away. Wouldn't you cling to any piece of it you could?" In Angola, locals expressed a mix of confusion and indifference about the unfolding drama. For them, The pressing issue was not royal titles, but the landmines still buried in their fields and roadsides. "Does it matter what he's called, as long as he helps?" asked one resident in Wombo, where Diana had once famously walked through a cleared minefield. Back in his hotel, Harry stood by the window, staring out at the night sky. The city lights of Luanda twinkled in the distance, but they seemed far away, unreachable. He thought again of his mother, how she had walked into dangerous places, unguarded and unassuming, yet had commanded respect through her actions alone. Was he living up to her legacy, or was he betraying it by allowing himself to be distracted by titles and formalities? The question gnawed at him as he turned away from the window and sank into a chair. Somewhere deep down, he knew this was more than just about a title. It was about the void he felt ever since stepping away from the royal family. The world had taken off his crown, but in his heart, he still felt its weight. And now, the world was watching. The walls of the hotel suite seemed to close in on him as the hours passed. Outside, Luanda hummed with life. Cars honked, music floated through the warm air, and the city pulsed with its usual rhythm. But inside, the silence was deafening. Harry sat in an armchair, his elbows on his knees, his hands pressed together like a man trying to hold himself steady against an invisible storm. The aides had retreated to the adjacent room to give him space. A few of them whispered nervously among themselves, their voices barely audible through the door. They knew he was furious, but they didn't dare approach yet. Harry's phone buzzed incessantly on the table beside him. Messages from London, texts from allies, missed calls from contacts he hadn't spoken to in months. And then there were the media alerts. Dozens of headlines flashing across the screen, each one more cutting than the last. Prince Harry throws tantrum over royal title in Angola. Royal without a crown. Is Harry lost without his Highness? Harry's walkout overshadows minefield campaign. Each notification felt like a tiny hammer striking his chest. He turned the phone face down, as if that could silence the voices of millions. Harry leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes, but sleep was impossible. His mind wouldn't stop racing. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had imagined this trip as a triumph. The image of him walking through Angola's minefields would dominate news cycles, reminding the world of his mother's compassion and courage. It would show his father, his critics, even Meghan's detractors that he was still a force for good, still worthy of admiration and respect. Instead, one word, one deliberate omission of "Your Highness" had set fire to the entire mission. Deep down, he knew the president hadn't meant it personally. It was about protocol, about politics, about the delicate balance of international relations. But Harry couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. That moment in the meeting room felt like the culmination of everything he had feared since walking away from royal life. Irrelevance, humiliation, and the quiet erasure of who he used to be. When he was still part of the firm, as the royals sometimes called themselves, Harry never had to fight for deference. It was automatic. The bowing heads, the careful "Your Highness," the subtle but constant reinforcement that he belonged to an ancient lineage. All of it had been the air he breathed. But now he was just a man with a famous name and a fading connection to the throne. The thought brought a bitter taste to his mouth. He remembered the moment when he and Meghan announced their decision to step back as senior royals. The world had been shocked, the tabloids had gone into overdrive, and his family had been less than forgiving. He told himself then that titles didn't matter, that freedom was worth more than any honorific. He could still do the work he loved, still be the man his mother raised him to be, even without the weight of His Royal Highness before his name. But sitting here now, watching his legacy unravel with every headline, Harry wasn't so sure. He got up and began pacing the room. His footsteps were silent on the plush carpet, but the turmoil in his mind was deafening. Was he wrong to walk out? Should he have swallowed the slight for the sake of the mission? Or was this refusal to use his title a line in the sand, a test of how much he was willing to compromise? He remembered his time in the army, his happiest years, he often said. In the military, no one cared about royal titles. To his fellow soldiers, he was simply Captain Wales. They respected him for his actions, not his birthright. That had been liberating. So why did it sting so badly now? Harry rubbed his face with both hands, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. He wanted to believe it wasn't about ego, that it was about respect for the work he was doing. But another voice, the quiet, brutal voice that surfaced in his most private moments, whispered a harsher truth. Perhaps he hadn't left the royal family as completely as he thought. Perhaps, deep down, he was still clinging to the remnants of a life he claimed to have outgrown. He thought of Meghan then, imagining what she would say if she were here. Would she have told him to let it go? Or would she have reminded him that without the formality of titles, the media and his detractors would never stop chipping away at his authority? He could almost hear her voice, calm and persuasive. "Harry, you've sacrificed enough already. Don't let them strip you of your dignity too." His aides knocked softly before entering. One of them, a young woman with a calm demeanor, held a tablet in her hands. "We've drafted a statement," she said carefully. "It focuses on the humanitarian mission and tries to steer attention back to the landmines. We thought you might want to review it before it goes out." Harry took the tablet, but didn't read the text right away. His eyes were distant, fixed on some point far beyond the hotel room walls. "They'll never let me escape it, will they?" he asked quietly. "Escape what?" the aide asked. "The crown. The titles. The weight of it all. Either I'm accused of clinging to it or running from it. There's no winning." The aide didn't answer. Harry set the tablet down without reading it. He walked to the window and stared out at the city lights again. Tomorrow, he would return to the minefields. He would walk the same ground his mother once did, smile for the cameras, shake the hands of local workers, and try to salvage what he could of this visit. But tonight, alone in this foreign city, Harry felt like a man untethered, neither prince nor private citizen, caught between two worlds and unsure if he truly belonged in either. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window and closed his eyes. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. The morning sun in Luanda broke through the hotel curtains, casting long golden streaks across the floor. But for Harry, there was nothing golden about this day. He hadn't slept. The night had been an endless loop of replaying the previous afternoon in his mind. Every word, every glance, every moment leading up to the instant he had stood from his chair in the president's meeting room and walked out. He had imagined himself walking tall, dignified, making a stand for respect. But now, in the cold light of day, he wasn't so sure. Was it strength that propelled him from that chair? Or was it pride? The world didn't wait long to weigh in. By the time Harry sat down to his breakfast of black coffee and untouched toast, his phone was buzzing with notifications. The headlines were brutal. Prince Harry's angry walkout in Angola, a diplomatic blunder. Is Harry still clinging to his lost royal status? From prince to pariah, Harry's title tantrum exposed. Social media was worse. Clips of Harry striding out of the meeting had surfaced online. Someone inside the compound, a staffer or aide, had secretly filmed part of the incident on their phone. Though no audio accompanied the grainy video, it didn't matter. The internet supplied its own narrative, painting Harry as a man who had thrown away the world's sympathy in exchange for a fleeting sense of superiority. In some clips, they looped the moment he slammed the meeting room door behind him, turning it into a meme. In others, angry voices debated his behavior, framing it as evidence that Harry had never truly shed the royal mindset he claimed to have rejected. Harry scrolled through a few posts, his stomach twisting. Who does he think he is? He wanted to leave the firm, and now he cries because no one calls him his Highness, one comment read. But then there were others, softer, more sympathetic. They're bullying him again. You can't just erase someone's entire identity overnight. He's Diana's son. That deserves respect. The split in public opinion only deepened Harry's unease. By mid-morning, the hotel suite became a command center. His aides paced the room, laptops open, phones pressed to ears. They were working frantically to regain control of the narrative. "We need to refocus the media on the humanitarian mission," one advisor said, her voice tight with urgency. "The landmines, the children, the communities. That's why we came here." Harry sat silently as they spoke, staring at the carpet. He knew they were right. But the words, "Mr. Harry," still rang in his ears like a mocking refrain. At noon, the convoy was ready to take him to the minefields. It had been arranged before the fallout, part of his planned itinerary. Cameras were already stationed at the site, waiting to capture the symbolic moment of Harry walking the treacherous terrain just as his mother had done. But as Harry stepped into the SUV, He felt the weight of those cameras like never before. This wasn't just about the mission anymore. Every movement he made, every expression he wore, would be scrutinized for evidence of arrogance, fragility, or redemption. The SUV pulled into a dusty field on the outskirts of Luanda, where demoning teams had been working for months. The air smelled faintly of earth and machine oil. Children and villagers gathered at a distance, their faces curious, cautious. Harry stepped out in a light blue shirt and khaki trousers, his sleeves rolled up. A bulletproof vest labeled Halo Trust was handed to him. He pulled it on slowly, his movements deliberate. This was supposed to be his redemption. But even as he began walking the cleared paths, careful to avoid straying into danger zones, he could feel the invisible presence of those headlines following him like shadows. Is this a prince trying to save lives? The world seemed to ask. Or a man trying to save his pride? He crouched to speak with a D minor, asking about the process and the risks they faced daily. The cameras clicked furiously, capturing every smile, every handshake, every thoughtful glance. But inside, Harry felt hollow. He thought about the meeting room, the cool expression of President Lorenzo, the deliberate refusal to say the words Harry longed to hear. Was it really about respect? Or had Harry demanded a deference that was no longer his to claim? Later, as he spoke at a small podium to thank the demoning teams for their work, Harry's voice was strong and steady. But those closest to him noticed the strain in his eyes, the slight pause before he spoke as though bracing himself for an invisible blow. "The world owes you a debt of gratitude," Harry said, his tone measured. "This work changes lives, saves lives. And it's my privilege to stand with you today." The audience clapped politely, and cameras flashed. On the surface, all appeared well. But in the age of viral media, appearances weren't enough. The videos from the presidential meeting still dominated the news cycle. Some headlines now softened their tone. Harry returns to minefields after walkout. Focus back on Diana's legacy. Others refused to let go. Prince or celebrity. Harry's identity crisis in Angola. As the sun dipped low and the day drew to a close, Harry sat once more in the SUV, staring out at the horizon. Dust swirled in the air as the convoy drove back toward the hotel. His aides had begun drafting yet another statement. One that would, they hoped, strike the perfect balance between humility and defiance. But Harry wasn't sure words could fix this. The walkout wasn't just a moment of frustration. It was a fracture, exposing a deeper truth he could no longer ignore. He was a man caught between two worlds, unable to fully belong to either. For the first time since arriving in Angola, Harry felt utterly alone. By the time Harry's plane lifted off from Luanda's tarmac 2 days later, the storm had already engulfed the globe. What began as a quiet humanitarian trip to honor his mother's memory had been transformed into a media spectacle of staggering proportions. The British tabloids were the first to strike, sharpening their knives with a familiar precision. Front pages screamed in bold, accusatory type. Prince Harry's title meltdown, a royal without a crown. His Highness no more. Harry's diplomatic walkout shocks Angola. Megxit Prince humiliated abroad. Refused respect he demands. In the hours that followed, the story radiated outwards. Across Europe, newspapers framed it as a cautionary tale about a man who couldn't let go of his royal past. In America, pundits on morning shows debated whether Harry had been wronged or whether he was guilty of the very entitlement he and Meghan had once claimed to escape. On social media, the narrative splintered into 1,000 competing interpretations. #HarryTitlegate trended globally on X, formerly Twitter, fueled by equal parts ridicule and defense. One viral post showed a split-screen image. On one side, Diana in her protective gear walking through an Angolan minefield. On the other, Harry striding out of a meeting room with a stormy expression. The caption read, "She walked into danger for others. He walked out over a title." It was shared over 1 million times in 24 hours. But not everyone piled on. Loyal supporters, many of them Meghan and Harry's most ardent defenders, pushed back fiercely. They pointed out that Harry had continued his mother's work, that he had sacrificed his place in the royal family for freedom and service, and that the focus on a single protocol disagreement distracted from the real issue: Angola's deadly minefields and the children at risk. One user wrote, "Funny how the media care more about calling him Mr. Harry than about the lives he's trying to save. This obsession with tearing him down is disgusting. Still, the tide was hard to turn. Every news cycle seemed to unearth another layer to the story. Anonymous sources emerged, claiming Harry's aides had repeatedly requested the president address him as His Highness during prior planning meetings. Others suggested Harry had been testy even before stepping into the presidential compound. British royal correspondents delighted in drawing parallels to Harry's exit from the firm. Harry wanted out, and he got his wish, said one commentator on a primetime talk show. But perhaps he didn't realize that when you step off the royal stage, the world no longer sees you as the star. The host chuckled dryly, adding, "If he insists on playing the prince, he shouldn't have left the palace." Over on American television, the tone was less scathing but no less speculative. A roundtable on a popular news network featured a heated exchange between two panelists. "Harry is human," one argued. "You can't expect someone born into royalty to shed decades of conditioning overnight. He's not clinging to his title out of arrogance. He's holding on to the only identity he's ever known." "But isn't that the whole point of leaving?" countered the other. "He wanted freedom. Well, here it is. Freedom comes without fanfare, without people bowing to you. You can't have it both ways." As the debate raged, the humanitarian mission Harry had hoped to spotlight faded into the background. The landmine crisis, the plight of Angolan families living in fear of explosive remnants. None of it seemed to matter as much as the drama of a fallen prince wrestling with his pride. Even in Angola, the incident hadn't gone unnoticed. Local newspapers ran articles questioning why the British prince had left the meeting so abruptly. Opinion pieces appeared, some sympathetic to Harry's desire for respect, others critical of what they saw as Western arrogance. "Respect is earned, not demanded," wrote one columnist in Luanda's leading daily. "We honor Diana's work, but Harry must understand that here, protocol is not a personal insult." Meanwhile, Buckingham Palace maintained its trademark silence. When asked for comment, a spokesperson offered a brief, non-committal statement. The Duke of Sussex's trip to Angola was undertaken in a personal capacity to support demoning efforts. "We have no comment on the reports regarding private meetings." But insiders whispered about King Charles's reaction. Some claimed the monarch was deeply disappointed that his son's visit had become mired in controversy. Others suggested Charles was sympathetic, privately acknowledging that his younger son's desire for respect was understandable given his upbringing. Regardless of the palace's stance, Harry felt the chill of their distance. He sat in the quiet of his private jet as it soared back toward London, staring blankly at the clouds outside the window. The faces of Angolan children he had met earlier flashed through his mind, the shy smiles, the nervous waves, the hope in their eyes. He had come to help them. He had wanted to make a difference. But now he couldn't escape the nagging thought that he had become the story, and not in the way he intended. His phone vibrated on the armrest beside him. It was Meghan. Harry hesitated before answering. When her face appeared on the screen, her expression was calm but searching. "I've been watching," she said softly. "How are you holding up?" Harry exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "It's a mess, Meg. They've twisted everything." "Again?" She nodded, her gaze steady. "We'll get through this, just like we've gotten through everything else." But even as she spoke, Harry felt the familiar weight settle in his chest, a heaviness that no amount of reassurance could lift. Because deep down, he wasn't sure this time if the world, or even he, would ever see him the same way again. Back in London, the air inside Buckingham Palace was colder than usual, not because of the weather, but because of the silence. The sort of silence that often preceded storms in royal corridors. Behind the gilded walls and polished oak doors, aides whispered in urgent tones while senior courtiers paced with guarded expressions. Prince Harry's actions in Angola had reached the palace long before he landed back on British soil, and the repercussions were already unfolding in ways that would prove hard to contain. The moment news broke that Harry had walked out of his meeting with President Lorenzo, the phones at Clarence House and Buckingham Palace began ringing incessantly. Journalists clamored for statements. Allies and critics of the crown wanted reactions. Even international embassies quietly inquired about whether the Duke of Sussex had acted as an envoy of the royal family, or as a private individual whose behavior was his own responsibility. King Charles was reportedly informed of the incident during his morning briefing. Sitting at his desk in his private study, he listened carefully as his secretaries summarized the chain of events. Harry's arrival in Angola, his request to be addressed as His Highness, the president's polite refusal, and the now infamous walkout that was dominating global headlines. The king's face, according to a source present, remained inscrutable. He listened without interruption, only occasionally lifting his hand to stroke his chin. A familiar gesture when he was deep in thought. When the aide finished, the room was heavy with expectation. Charles placed his pen down with a soft clink against the mahogany surface. "And so it begins again," he murmured, almost to himself. For Charles, the situation presented a delicate dilemma. On one hand, Harry was still his son, and the king's instincts leaned toward protecting his family. On the other hand, the Duke of Sussex had stepped away from royal duties years earlier. Publicly defending Harry might risk sending mixed signals about the monarchy's stance on his status. The senior advisors were divided. Some urged the king to release a statement reinforcing the palace's respect for Angola's protocol and clarifying that Harry was not acting in any official royal capacity. "Your Majesty, we must draw a line," one advisor insisted. "The public already perceives Harry as trying to play prince without the responsibilities." Silence could be interpreted as tacit approval of his conduct. Others counseled restraint. "Perhaps saying nothing is wiser," a more cautious voice suggested. "Every comment risks feeding the fire. This will pass, as all storms do." And a heavy-handed response could deepen the family rift. But the question hanging over all of them was unavoidable. How did the king himself feel about his son's actions? Privately, those close to Charles say his reaction was far more complicated than the palace's public posture would suggest. He understood why Harry might have felt diminished by being addressed as Mr. Harry. Charles knew better than anyone how much weight titles carried within the family, how they weren't just ceremonial, but deeply tied to identity and public perception. But he was also disappointed. In the privacy of his study, he reportedly confided to Queen Camilla that Harry's behavior reflected a lack of perspective. "It's not the title that matters," Charles said quietly. "It's the work." Diana never demanded deference, yet she commanded it wherever she went. That was her true gift. Camilla, who had watched Harry's journey from prince to private citizen with both empathy and skepticism, placed a reassuring hand on her husband's arm. "He's still finding his footing," she said. "But you know, Charles, some shoes are too heavy to walk away from entirely." At Kensington Palace, Prince William was said to have been less sympathetic. When an aide briefed him on Harry's walkout, his response was sharp and unambiguous. "This is exactly why we've kept a clear boundary," William reportedly said. He wanted independence, and yet he continues to drag the family into his missteps. It's exhausting. The brothers' relationship, already strained to the point of near silence, seemed destined to suffer another blow. William, who had embraced his role as heir with increasing gravitas, viewed Harry's actions as yet another example of why his younger brother could no longer be trusted to act with the discipline expected of a royal. But others within the family whispered that William's frustration was not without pain. Once, the two had been inseparable. Now, each new headline seemed to widen the chasm between them. In public, the palace maintained its tradition of stoic silence. Reporters were told, "We have no comment on private matters concerning the Duke of Sussex." But within the royal press corps, speculation ran wild. Are they washing their hands of him completely? One veteran correspondent mused. Or are they biding their time to deliver a more calculated response? The truth was more nuanced. Behind the palace gates, strategies were quietly drawn up to insulate the crown from Harry's fallout. Staffers worked late into the night crafting talking points for future engagements, ensuring that senior royals would be prepared if asked about the incident. The king's focus remains on his duties as sovereign. One draft of a potential response read, "He supports the humanitarian causes championed by members of the royal family and wishes all those involved in demoning efforts every success." But no matter how they spun it, the reality was plain to see. Harry's actions in Angola had reopened old wounds, not just with his family, but with the public he once captivated so effortlessly. At the heart of Buckingham Palace, Charles stared out the window at the manicured gardens below. He thought of Diana, of her trips to Angola, and of the legacy she had left behind. A part of him ached for Harry, for the boy he had watched grow under impossible pressures. But as king, he had learned that compassion alone could not steer the ship. There were responsibilities heavier than any crown, and sometimes even family ties had to bend beneath the weight of duty. Perhaps, he said softly to himself, this is the moment he realizes what he's truly given up. As Harry's plane crossed the European airspace, the tension inside the cabin was as thick as the clouds outside. He sat by the window, staring blankly at the horizon, his reflection faint in the glass. In his hand, he held his phone, his thumb hovering over Meghan's name in his recent calls list. He had spoken to her briefly from Angola after the walkout, but now, as he approached London, he felt a gnawing need for her voice, her perspective, her steady reassurance. For months, Meghan had been his anchor in turbulent waters. Together, they had navigated the glare of royal life, the transition to independence, and the backlash that seemed to follow them like a shadow. But Harry couldn't help wondering now if her counsel had played a part in this latest storm. He thought back to their conversation before he left for Angola. "Do you think I should ask them to use my title?" he had asked her one evening as they sat in their Montecito garden. Meghan had looked up from the book in her lap, her eyes calm but sharp. "Why wouldn't you?" she said. "You're still a prince. They know that. It's not about ego, Harry. It's about setting the tone. If you don't stand firm, people will walk all over you." Harry had nodded, her words echoing the feelings he hadn't yet fully admitted to himself. "You're not just Harry," Meghan continued. "You're Diana's son. The world expects to see that strength in you. Own it." At the time, it had felt like sound advice. But now, after everything that unfolded in Angola, Harry wasn't so sure. Was he holding on to his title as a necessary symbol of his identity, or had he crossed the line into entitlement? As the plane began its descent, Harry scrolled through the news articles flooding his feed. Some criticized him for clinging to royal formalities. Others blamed Meghan, painting her as the puppet master behind his decisions. Meghan pushed Harry to demand royal treatment, insiders claim. Duchess's shadow over Harry's title drama. The headline stung. He knew how quickly the narrative could shift against her, how swiftly the world sought to cast her as the villain in every royal story. He remembered how Meghan had been portrayed when they first stepped back from royal life, how she was painted as the schemer, the manipulator, the woman who pulled H.